Modifiers within 3ds Max allow us to access specific areas of our 3D scene objects and, as the name suggests, modify them in some way. Some modifiers are very specific in what they do, whilst others are actually very large and elaborate systems that in some cases can be better thought of as actually small programs or utilities in their own right. If you look at this list of modifiers, you can see that Autodesk has arranged them under a number of logical headings. Obviously the headings can give you a pretty good idea of what the modifiers do within each of the groups. Now, the listing shown here is not necessarily the definitive order that you should think of these modifiers within. It's possible to think of your own categories of similar functionality. For instance, under Patch Spline Editing, you'll note that the Edit Patch modifier, whilst under Mesh Editing you can see the Edit Mesh and Edit Poly modifiers. I tend to think of these as the Edit modifiers, as they each have very similar functionality that is tailored to each of the main geometry types. So if I wanted to, I could actually create a new group and have those three modifiers underneath that group. So it's actually possible using the Configure Modify Groups button to actually go in and create your own groups. So the order and groupings shown here are useful but not necessarily definitive. Let's have a look at each one of the main groups in turn and see what the modifiers contained within each group deal with. The selection modifiers deal specifically with selecting sub-elements of an object, which are then passed up the stack for the next modifier to act upon. These modifiers are totally topologically sensitive, apart from the volume select modifier. The first three modifiers in the list all store their selections based on a numbered index. For instance, the vertex or face index. Let's say you have vertex number 2, number 4, number 19, number 44, 46 and so on selected. The upshot of this is of course that if the numbers of faces being passed on to the selection modifier change below in the stack, then the actual faces selected will change, and this can cause quite major issues with your procedural workflow. Let's quickly have a look at that now. So you can see I've got three objects here, and two of them are actually using these selection modifiers. You can see we've got a mesh select here, and that's actually passing on a selection to this freeform deformation. And over here you can see I've got a patch object, and that's actually taking an editable patch object here. Then we've got a patch select which actually selects these vertices here, and then they're passed on to a noise modifier. Now, out of these objects, the only one which is actually still procedural is this cylinder here and this box here. Now, if I actually go in here and change the vertices that I'm selecting, I'll just turn on show end result. So, as I add more vertices to the selection, you can see they're being passed up the stack to the FFD modifier. They're actually changing the shape of the object. So I'll just select these vertices here, and you can see we've got this effect going on, and I'll pass that on up at the stack. Now if I go down to the original box object, you can see we've got a tessellation value here. We've got three vertices, 3 and 3. If I turn on wireframe, you can actually see that you've got these three vertices by 3 by 3. And now if I change these values, you can see exactly what I was talking about. And what's actually happening here is the number of vertices is changing, obviously, but also the numbers, the indexed numbers on these vertices is changing. And the mesh select modifier is actually using the same indices, and so you're getting these erroneous results because obviously now those numbers don't mean the same thing anymore, as you can see. So you get these quite strange results. So if I put these back to where they were before, you can see now that the actual indexes are actually completely screwed up basically, and we don't actually have the same kind of result anymore. But we can go in and we can actually fix that. We can go in here, we can select these, and then we can pass them back up the stack, as you can see, and it works in the way it did before. So as you can see, these modifiers, selection modifiers, are topologically dependent, pretty much. Now if we look at this one here, as I said, all we've got here is an editable patch cylinder which actually created from a parametric cylinder. Then I've selected the vertices on the end of the cylinder, and they're being passed on to this noise modifier here, and that's having this kind of warping effect on the end of the cylinder there. And you can see I can change the scale values here of the noise. I can change the phase value here, and if I just turn on animated noise, you'll see what actually happens there. You can have that animate, which is pretty cool. And if I go back down and select some more control points, we can pass those on up the stack, as you can see. And now if I animate that, you can see those control points are animating as well. So you can see you can use these selection modifiers to actually pass on a selection. Now, the odd one out is this third modifier here, and what this one allows you to do is to actually use a mesh or a gizmo to actually define a selection of vertices. Now, we've got a cylinder here, and I'll just show you what the stack's actually doing. We've got a cylinder, you can see it's parametric. Then we've got a volume select modifier, and that's set at the moment to use a mesh object, and I've picked selection 3, which is this object here. And what it's actually doing is, if we look at it, it's taking, it's selecting the vertices when there's an intersection between this object and this object here. So let's actually show that in action. And then what's actually happening then is that selection's being passed up to this freeform deformation. So if I select this object and move it down, you can see that as now this is actually giving quite a sort of exaggerated result here. That's actually because I've got soft selection turned on. If I turn that off, you'll see the effect a little bit more absolutely. As it intersects the object, you'll see it selects vertices, and as the vertices are selected, they pop into place, and that happens as I move the object down. So you can see that as we're moving down, we're actually getting these vertices to be selected. And if I select this object, you can actually see that's the case. Now, what I actually did there to make it a little bit softer looking in its result was actually to turn on soft selections, and we can actually change the size of those. We'll just make that a little bit tighter. And now you'll see you get a sort of softer ease in as the object goes into place. So those are pretty cool. Those are the selection modifiers. Let's move on now and have a look at the patch and spline modifiers. Now, this group contains both spline and patch related modifiers, and this has been done as the surface modifiers actually allow you to define a patch surface via the use of splines. There's a kind of relationship going on there between patch surfaces and splines. Of late though, this kind of workflow has actually fallen out of favour due to the rise of polygon modelling techniques, and generally polymodelling techniques, sub-D modelling, is actually more flexible. Still, the spline tools in 3ds Max are very powerful, and they also come into their own when you're working on animation, and also when you're using more technical modelling techniques to model technical objects such as mechanical objects, steam trains, cars, mobile phones, that kind of thing. And it's in those circumstances where lathes and extrusions and so on, lofts, they all come into their own. So let's very quickly have a look at some objects that we've actually got here to show you some of the modifiers in action. The first modifier that we have here is I've got a spline circle, which I just created a parametric spline, and then I've applied a surface modifier to it from that group, and that just, as you can see, it actually creates a surface out of that spline. The next modifier we've got is another renderable, sorry, we've got another spline object here, and I've actually applied a renderable spline modifier to it, and that actually allows us to modify its renderable parameters, so we can actually see it in the viewport, and we can see it at render time as well. And that actually allows us to very quickly convert a spline object into a mesh without having to do any sort of lofting or anything like that. Now, you may say, what's the advantage of actually having a modifier to do this? Well, if I just create another bunch of splines here, I'll create an n-gon and a star, and you'll actually notice that each one of these has their own rendering control. So I can actually set these up here, and I'll do the same for this one.